Reducing the bloodshed in Syria, word of a peace plan that could change the course of the war. The deal announced a short time ago by the top diplomats from the United States and Russia. The DPRK conducts its strongest nuclear test yet. Reaction from around the world straight ahead.
Live from Washington, this is the CCTV America News Desk.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington, D.C. A breakthrough at last on the complicated and bloody crisis in Syria. After marathon negotiations in Geneva, the top diplomats from the United States and Russia agreed on steps to reduce the violence. Sergei Lavrov and John Kerry spoke to reporters a short time ago. Roy Ruttenberg joins me in the studio with the details. Roy, do we know what the cessation of hostilities entail?
Yeah, first, the halting of all attacks, including airstrikes, beginning at sundown on September 12th. That's the first day of the Muslim Eid holiday, so really quite symbolic. And if it happens, we'll effectively see a grounding of Syrian aircraft. So that's really quite significant. Second, unimpeded humanitarian access to areas in need, including the divided city of Aleppo, where the civilian population, as we know, has been caught in the middle of this fighting for years. And third, the establishment of a joint implementation center to track down fighters for ISIL, also known as Daesh, and al-Nusra Front, and to separate those fighters from so-called moderate opposition groups who are fighting against Syrian forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad. Afterwards, joint airstrikes will be carried out by Russia and the U.S. to target these terror groups, ISIL and al-Nusra. And that's really been the tricky point here in the past. How do you separate the good guys from the bad guys, and even more difficult, who gets to decide who's good and who's bad? John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, has called this plan the most prescriptive and far-reaching proposal for Syria so far. And Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has said it could only succeed if all of the sides have confidence in the Russian-U.S. cooperation.
Roy, I thought it was
the Obama administration, the United States, is going the extra mile here because we believe that Russia and my colleague have the capability to press the Assad regime to stop this conflict and to come to the table and make peace.
And Roy, they're calling this a cessation of hostilities once again, not a permanent ceasefire. And of course, the hope here is to get the Syrians involved in a permanent solution.
That's right, but even the cessation of hostilities needs the support of various Syrian parties where it won't work. We also want to play a comment from Sergei Lavrov, who is also speaking there. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
And this is not the end of the road and the way. That is just the beginning of our new relations, and we hope that all those who dearly value peace and the integrity of the multinational and multi-confessional Syrian state will support our arrangements.
We're already hearing that the Russian leadership has spoken with President Assad and that he supports the deal, and that the Americans, of course, are talking with the opposition groups that they've been backing. Remember, though, this isn't the first one of these agreements we've seen. There was one announced back in February. That didn't hold. That's because there's lots of different stakeholders involved in this conflict, many of them having different interests here. Kerry and Lavrov recognized that and said the conversation must also be inclusive of these various Syrian groups and also the outside circles that are assisting with these talks. We should point out these talks went well into the morning in Geneva. It was the third time that Lavrov and Kerry met in the last 2 weeks. They also spoke by phone many times in between. Both sides now have 48 hours to convince the various players to get on board. John Kerry is heading back to Washington, but he faces strong opposition from U.S. and defense officials here in Washington. They argue, Asiye, that Moscow can't be trusted.
And just to clarify, the cessation of hostilities takes effect September 12th on Sunday.
Correct.
Roy Ruttenberg, thank you so much. Another major story we're following, alarm and global condemnation after DPRK's latest nuclear test. It's the second this year and the strongest so far, so strong that it caused an earthquake. The UN Security Council has been meeting behind closed doors. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon condemned the test and called for action. CCTV's Nick Harper is at the UN headquarters and filed this report.
The DPRK's latest and largest nuclear test drew a swift response from the United Nations, the Secretary-General himself speaking out against Pyongyang.
I condemn in the strongest possible terms the underground nuclear test by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This is yet another brazen breach of the resolutions of the Security Council.
The gravity of the situation shown by the fact that he spoke more personally than usual, expressing regret and sadness that as he prepares to exit the UN after 10 years in charge, he has not been able to stop the DPRK's nuclear weapons program. The UN's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, also condemned the test.
This is in clear violation of numerous UN Security Council resolutions and in complete disregard of the repeated demands of the international community. It is a deeply troubling and regrettable act.
The UN Security Council has adopted 5 resolutions against the DPRK since its first nuclear test in 2006. The most recent set of sanctions, imposed back in March, were described by the US ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, as the strongest imposed by the Council in more than 2 decades. And yet, time and again, the DPRK has ignored them, leaving many to wonder what the UN can do to stop Pyongyang. But the Council's next move is increasingly limited. Banning fuel oil from entering the country has been suggested, but the fear is that would hurt the ordinary citizens far more than the country's leaders. A new set of UN sanctions may be proposed, but it would take several days before the Council is likely to agree and then vote on them. And even then, based on past experience, there's little chance the DPRK will listen. Nick Harper, CCTV, New York.
The latest provocation from Pyongyang raised anxiety in capitals around the world. CCTV's Jessica Stone has more on that part of the story.
The DPRK is in practical isolation from the world, and China really remains the closest thing it has to an ally. Beijing repeatedly called on DPRK leaders to keep the calm on the peninsula. That calm appears to be falling on deaf ears. This is what the Chinese Foreign Ministry had to say on Friday.
Achieving denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, preventing nuclear proliferation, and safeguarding peace and stability in Northeast Asia have always been China's firm stance. We strongly urge the DPRK side to honor the commitment to denuclearization, abide by the relevant UN Security Council resolutions, and halt any move that could aggravate the situation.
Friday's test was the biggest test to date, but China's official news agency, Xinhua, called it, quote, not wise. Meantime, the DPRK's neighbors are calling for consequences as powerful as Pyongyang's latest nuclear test. Seoul plans to boost psychological warfare efforts by increasing the number of propaganda loudspeakers along the border with the DPRK. And ROK scientists say this nuclear test put off twice as much energy as the January test. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and South Korean President Park Geun-hye both say the reaction from the international community should also be more powerful.
The DPRK nuclear threat is an imminent and existing threat to us, to the point that our and the international community's response should be completely different from what it had been.
U.S. President Barack Obama has also been in touch with the leaders of Japan and the ROK and is calling for the strictest sanctions yet. The U.S. defense chief said he had spoken with American allies and also called for tighter sanctions.
This nuclear test constitutes a direct challenge to the entire international community. It is another destabilizing and provocative act by North Korea that further heightens anxiety on the Korean Peninsula and throughout the vital Asia-Pacific region.
Russia, which is also part of the diplomatic effort to denuclearize the peninsula, is also reacting, saying, quote, we insist that the North Korean side end its dangerous and reckless misadventures, comply in good faith with all UN Security Council directives, completely abandon its nuclear missile programs, and return to the NPT regime. Now, the DPRK claims it can produce a lot of nuclear warheads that will fit on ballistic rockets. Analysts in the ROK still don't believe the DPRK can do that, but do say they're getting closer. Jessica Stone, CCTV, Washington.
So what more can be done to curb Pyongyang's actions? I spoke to international security expert Jim Walsh.
sanctions alone are not going to solve the problem. By themselves, they're never designed to solve the problem. You have to marry that to a larger political strategy. We had success in Iran because there were sanctions, but those sanctions were part of a negotiation that got a settlement in which all parties benefited. And so, yes, we need to improve sanctions. My partner and I have made 11 recommendations on how to do that, but none of that's going to matter unless there's a political strategy, and part of that will be negotiations.
It seems you and I, have talked about this many times before. Repeated sanctions are not deterring DPRK from conducting these tests. Certainly, they're not listening to the international community. They're not even listening to China, their closest ally. So give us the bigger picture. What needs to happen? What's next?
Yeah, my partner, John Park at Harvard, and I just finished a study this summer looking at North Korea's sanctions and why they aren't working. And we focused in on something we call North Korea Inc. We interviewed North Korean defectors who worked for state trading companies who actually their job was to beat sanctions, to evade and to procure illicit goods. And what we discovered is, yes, we've put on sanctions, but they've innovated. They've responded. This is an iterative game, and they've made counter moves. And we keep doing the same thing, singing the same song, only with a louder voice each time. And we need to change. We need to get smarter about how we go after North Korean procurement. And we need China's help on this. And China is caught in a pickle here. It doesn't want to crush and have a failed state on its border, but it doesn't want the North to have nuclear weapons. So the U.S. and China are going to have to work much more cooperatively than they have. And I think the Chinese, one of the new things that we argue for, that we recommend, the Chinese can use their domestic laws, for example, the anti-corruption campaign, and focus that on private Chinese brokers, the middlemen who have been the big change for North Korean procurement. It's these middlemen who have really increased the sophistication and capability of North Korean WMD procurement. So let's target them and go after them, and I think that would help somewhat.
Is this the kind of man, Kim Jong-un, Jim, who could possibly do the unthinkable, meaning from conducting various tests to the real thing here?
It's a great question, and the unthinkable sort of goes in two different directions here. Do I think he would use nuclear weapons? No, not on purpose, because that would be suicide. He would, again, their main objective is to keep power. If they were to use them, it would guarantee that they would be swept from power, and that that country would be wiped away. So I don't think they're going to do it. The danger here is that he's going to make a mistake, or he's going to, come up with a bad idea, and every one of his lieutenants, no one's going to raise their hand and say, "That's a dumb idea, boss," because they don't want to get shot. So I think the risk of accident or misperception, those sorts of things, is a real issue. Now, on the positive side, because he does seem, a little erratic, or is able to change his views, he has been saying over and over again, we're going to be a nuclear weapon state, we're going to be a nuclear weapon state. One can only hope that there's, in a state with one-man rule, if he changes his mind and says, yes, we can negotiate, yes, we can freeze this program, that he is unpredictable enough to do that, to do something positive. But I don't think he wants to commit suicide, but that doesn't mean there aren't dangers here, and those are the dangers we have to pay attention to.
All right, Jim Walsh, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Stranded in the sky, imagine trapped in cable cars dangling above the French Alps. More on the terrifying ordeal and the daring rescue operation.